The Nerdcast Empire is on the air. It is Music Mondays once again on the Nerdcast Empire. I am Matt in the studio. Great to have you along with us, and a big thanks to everybody that has been listening to Music Mondays. It's been our most downloaded episodes each and every week. We certainly appreciate that, and a big thank you to all the bands out there that have shared our posts as well. Certainly help increase our reach around the world, as it turns out, for Music Mondays. We've got a really outstanding episode coming up with some great music. Outstanding releases from March the 8th. Joining me, as always, in studio, the man who does all the work to put these lists together to allow us to do Music Mondays. It's Mike. Mike, how's it going?
Big week this week. A lot of really good music. So, yeah, no complaints.
Yeah, I think there's going to be some stuff left out this week that in other weeks probably would have easily made our picks, but certainly makes it interesting. Joining us from parts unknown is Chris. Chris, how's it going?
Going great. I'm excited to see what other countries we can tap into this week. I know a couple weeks ago we started hitting into the Sweden market and Australia, and as of last week, we're now tracking in Norway. So let's see who else we can add to the list.
I think we're going to expand that list again this week because we have some more countries to add to the list. And there were actually a couple of countries that we didn't end up picking the bands this week that, like I said, probably could have made the list under most weeks. But before we get to each of our individual choices, we try to put at the beginning of the program, if there's a big band or a band that we follow that has a new release, we try to kind of talk about them up top so they don't really count in our choices. And maybe one of the biggest bands that we would follow, and certainly one of my favorite bands in this genre of music that we deal with so often, had a release on March the 8th. That's Sonata Arctica with their new release, Clear, Cold, Beyond. Had a chance to listen to it for the first time today, and it's pretty fantastic. We'll get Mike's thoughts in a moment, but just as a general vibe after listening to it once, it definitely feels like a great meshing of kind of going back to that old sound that was in their earlier albums, but yet also trying to continue to take it forward and develop it in a new way. It's a great combination of both. And if you're a fan of Sonata Arctica, if you're a fan of power metal, this is an album you absolutely have to pick up. Mike, your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. This is their 11th studio album, Clear, Cold, Beyond. I've been a fan of everything this band's done since the beginning, but honestly, it was really their first couple albums that got me in the door and made me a fan. So when you kind of hear the rumblings about this album being maybe a return to some of that form, you get excited about it. And from my first few listens, what I kind of get is pretty much every song on this album kind of reminds you of a certain era of the band. So they do kind of revisit that older sound without really abandoning where else they've been throughout their career now, which is, 26 years, give or take?
And they've been around for a long time. There's a couple of quotes from the Blabbermouth review of it that I really thought kind of hit the nail on the head. Mentioned Clear, Cold, Beyond being a collection of songs that echo past glories while still moving in a forward direction. This is where Sonata Arctica harnesses the best of both worlds. Be unfair to say the Sonata Arctica are back because they never went away. But by reconnecting with the spirit of those cherished early works, they have created one of their strongest and most satisfying albums to date. Really, like I said, I really couldn't have said it any better myself. That really feels like the gist of this album.
Yeah, absolutely. It would be easy to just go back and completely do Ecliptica again, only with, instead of re-recording it, doing new songs in that same vein. And that's not really what they did here. That being said, when you kind of get into the album, the first track, First in Line, feels like Blank File from Ecliptica. That drum intro with the speed and the guitars and keys, it kind of gives you that feeling again from the old days. The second track, California, kind of delivers on that as well, where it's pretty much a straight speed metal track. From there, like the third track, Shamat, feels a little more like something, at least in my opinion, that you would have found off like the Unia album, which is still not a bad thing at all. Moving on to Dark Empath, which is a great track. It kind of reminds me of a song like The End of This Chapter from Silence, which is a tremendous song and album. That being said, pretty much every track going down just kind of gives you that familiar feeling of, hey, this sounds kind of like when they did this album. And other tracks I'd really recommend, Angel Defiled later on in the album. Really cool keyboard on it. Another really fast track with kind of a unique vocal style. It's really cool. And the album winds down with a cover of Martika's Toy Soldier, which I think they perform really well too.
Yeah, I thought it was a great cover. And you mentioned Angel Defiled. That was one of my favorite tracks in the first listen through. These guys are really good, and they have been for a long time. All of their releases are excellent, but this does feel like both a step back and a step forward, if you will, as a way to harken back to the stuff they've done in the past that made them so successful, but also continue to take it forward in a new modern approach to that. And I think that's when you're a band that has the kind of loyal, dedicated following that they do, that is a great step to take. We'll note, not that these guys will ever listen to this podcast. We've had some of the bands that we've tagged listen, but these guys obviously maybe on a different level of fame. But if by some chance they happen to listen to this podcast, guys, please tour the States again. Like, we would like to see you in person again. We've seen you a couple times. You're amazing. We would love to get the chance to see Sonata Arctica. I would love to see some sort of big European power metal tour where they could put together like 5 or 6 bands and maybe tour some bigger venues and get a chance to see a lot of this music live.
Yeah, I think either that or even like your big hard rock metal festivals. There's a place in those vast lineups for music like this that I think sometimes gets underserved.
100%. So definitely check out Sonata Arctica, Clear Cold Beyond. Love these guys, and great to see them continuing to rock on in their 11th studio album. Now that we have that out of the way, it's time to look at our weekly choices. Again, these are from the releases of March the 8th. And as always, we're going to let Mike kick it off. So, Mike, what do you have for your first choice of the week?
Yeah, so there was no lack of options this week. Just a lot of really solid music. The first one I picked was interesting because listening to the first track, it was one of those things where you really had no idea where it was going to go, like whether it was going to be just straight black metal, just ultra deathy, and it wasn't any of that. That being said, my first pick is the second full-length album from the French doom metal band Ecclesia with Ecclesia Militans.
Yeah, I'll be honest. If I would have just put on the first track of this album, I might not have gone any farther because it is not like anything else on the album, but that's why you kind of have to listen to a few tracks and get the feeling. And like the moment the second track kicks in, If She Floats, like that's a certified hit right there on what is a very dark topic. I'll let you get into the album.
Yeah, so as stated in their Bandcamp, the album description, armed with the purifying fire, blessed swords, and holy rage, Ecclesia's lyrical themes deal with the 12th century dark medieval age of Holy Inquisition. So you know what you're getting yourself into. And when you have song titles like If She Floats, The Exorcism, and Harvester of Sinful Souls, you kind of see where they're going, and it delivers on all of those.
I didn't really know what sound to expect from them because, again, that first track gives nothing away as far as what this is going to sound like. But you know, even though you have some of those darker themes, it's not really darker music. It has this kind of, I don't want to say uplifting because maybe that's a little too strong, but it is definitely not like dark and grungy and growly. It definitely has a great sound.
Yeah, when I think doom metal, I typically think of like bands like Candlemass, and I expect maybe more of a downtrodden voice. And the lead singer of this band, Arnwald R, I believe his name is, his vocals sound a little more like Halford than they do anything too doomy. One of the supporters on Bandcamp kind of put it really well. Their name was Saffron Robe. They stated, it's classic doom, free from any sludge or stoner impurities. And I think that's why I enjoyed it so much.
Yeah, just to run down the rest of the names of these guys, we have Frater Ignis Sasser on bass, the Witchfinder General on guitar, Conrad the Inquisitor on guitar, and the Priest on drums. Not Damian Priest, presumably, but just
not
the
a priest, the priest.
The Priest. I love the theme. They certainly went with it all the way. Just like I said, I'm really impressed with this release.
Yeah, and I think if it's something that just based on that description sounds interesting, check out their video for Et Cum Spiritu Tuo. Really cool video, very theatric, and the band looks like some sort of members of a rival religious order to the members of Ghost. So I don't know exactly if there's something going on there, but really cool visual presentation. One of the members is playing a keytar. How can you go wrong with that?
Yeah, when I saw that video, I was sold on these guys even before I heard what it sounded like. And then again, just like you said, I would not have expected it. It was totally different and in such a great way. I think this is really, really good stuff. Chris, your thoughts on Ecclesia?
And Mike talked about the music videos, and I think that's what got them almost on my list to begin with. Just the visuals, their robes. They almost resemble like if the Jabberwocky gang started a cult, but that combined that with their sound, and it was definitely right up my alley, and obviously Mike's as well.
Yeah, as I said, it was really, really good. It was certainly been a solid choice for me as well. And like I said, this is going to be one of those weeks that there's not only so much to choose from, but really all of us could have kind of interchangeably chosen the acts that we ended up choosing because there's so much overlap in the styles this week, which I think is really, really nice. So that was pick number one. It was a great one. Definitely check out Ecclesia Militants for their album. But let's go on to number two, another really interesting band. Who's your second choice this week?
Yeah, again, like I mentioned before, there were so many options, and part of me wanted to go with any number of the really cool prog metal and rock bands that were out there. But I stumbled into this group, which is definitely more gothic rock, but really thought they had a cool sound. And that is the band Vlad in Tears with their most recent album, Relapse.
Yeah, again, this is another group that from the name, you just don't really get a feeling for what they're going to sound like. But man, I was really kind of blown away by this as well. This was another group that I easily could have chose this release as well. Just kind of some details on Relapse.
Yeah, details on this band were kind of sketchy at best. From what I saw on their website, it sounds like they kind of went away for a while, then came back in 2013, presumably a few brothers together in this band. I saw an album of theirs going as far back as 2007, but this is their 9th studio album. When I say gothic rock, think Him. I mean, the visual and the sound very much Him-like. Also kind of reminiscent of the Finnish rock band, the Rasmus, during their kind of more gothy phase for Dead Letters and Hide from the Sun. It's gothic rock, but not too gothic. There's still a heavy emphasis on the rock, which I think is why I've enjoyed it so much. And it's a little softer still than bands like Sentenced or Poison Black.
Yeah, I think Dead Rhetoric had a review of it that really kind of tied all that together. They mentioned with Relapse, Vlad and Tears seem to have hit their stride, and the balance between heavy rock, alternative, and gothic sounds. It's a cross-pollination style that allows the group to explore a wide array of influences, in turn probably accelerating the audience they could appeal to. I think that's really a good way to say it. Sometimes you hear that goth term and it does kind of pigeonhole you, but this is a group that's going to appeal to hard rock fans, to alternative fans. It's kind of a crossover group.
Yeah, I would agree. And take songs like Broken Bones. That song very much sounds like Hymns for About the Wings of a Butterfly. Definitely something there for everyone. It's not too much of any one thing, I think, which is really cool. I also noticed a little earlier on, a few years ago, they actually had a cover of Kate Bush's Running Up That Hill, which to me, my favorite version of that is Jorn Land's version, which is definitely a metal cover of it. This one's a little more true to the original song, but still really cool.
Yeah, it's another really awesome band that moved from Italy to Germany, I guess, to kind of gain their musical influences back in 2013. And they've done a really nice job with this release. I think everybody should check this one out.
Yeah.
Chris, your thoughts on Vlad in Tears?
Yeah, I love when brothers can come together. Growing up and kind of being in a band of my own with my brothers, it's great to see that a couple of folks that all share a love of music and finally strike it big, and hope their fandom only keeps growing.
Yeah, definitely. I think this is a good step in that direction. Again, just not really pigeonholing themselves in that gothic rock theme. I think is going to allow them to expand their audience, and kind of interested to see where this band continues to go from here. But two really good choices once again, and two very diverse choices as well. We're going to head over to Chris in Parts Unknown to get his choices for the week. Chris, what was your first choice of the week?
Yeah, I'm actually going to start with kind of a bonus choice. So as we've kind of shared our podcast episodes with the bands that we've been plugging, we did have a kind of share and shout out from one of your bands last week, Matt Tidstiv, and I commented just thanking them, and they actually gave me a whole bunch of bands that I should check out. I know we're still kind of getting into the European metal scene, or the Swedish and Norway. So they recommended a whole bunch of Norwegian bands, and then a Swedish rock band that I want to plug on here called, let me make sure I can get this right. I'm probably going to butcher it. Skraeckoedlan. If you look them up, they're a band that if you look them up on Facebook, they're not going to be labeled as just a band. They're going to be labeled as performing arts. And I think that's perfect. Looking at their page, they're about to be coming out with a new album, Vermilion Sky. They've released a couple singles so far, but behind that album, they have released a 45,000 word sci-fi novel, 8 chapters to go with this album, kind of describing the story behind it. And they created a video game that you can find online, and they're offering copies of the records, merch to anyone that can hit the top 3 on the high score list for this game. So very multi-talented outside of even music. As far as their musical content goes, they're kind of labeled as our typical stoner rock that we keep coming across. But I've come to realize that just kind of means that they're here to take you on a journey. Their name actually translates to terrifying lizard, or kind of an obsolete word for dinosaur. And a lot of the themes across their 3 albums kind of deal with like ancient beings or dinosaurs and reptiles. And I think there's even a song called Squid Man, Mothra. So really interesting names and storytelling all behind some heavy riff driven music. So definitely want to get them out there for people to check out and kind of show Norway some more love.
Yeah, honestly, I haven't had a chance to check these guys out. I don't know if you got the chance to see any of this stuff yet, Mike.
Yeah, I did check out a couple of their songs on YouTube, one of which was called Parlor, and if I'm pronouncing that right, but it looked like Parlor. A really cool sound. My take on it was it sounded like some sort of electro, stoner, industrial rock. It was really interesting. Another song, Cactus, just had this really kind of muddy, stoner-ishy riff to it, which was cool. And Vermilion Sky was another one I enjoyed.
Nice. So we'll definitely tag them in our post when we post this episode, because I'm not going to attempt to pronounce that name. I give Chris credit for giving it a swing on the first go, but
and kind of like right up our alley as well for Vermilion Sky, the single that they've already released. They actually redid that single in an 8-bit version, which is right up our alley, talking about all the 8-bit, 16-bit video games that we talk about. And it's just as worth a listen as the regular version. But really great that we can get some of these bands that we're tagging to listen to our podcast, and that a band from Norway can share a band from Sweden to a couple small town guys in the US, and we can all kind of share the love here.
I'm kind of stunned by just the depth of their work. I mean, beyond just the music, I have to wonder how many people are involved in this project and how many hours are in their day that they can actually do that much work and have that wide of a scope to what they're doing.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy, to be honest with you. So definitely check those guys out. Great to be able to suggest more bands from that area of the world, and we'll certainly continue to do that as the weeks go on. In fact, I think you're going to, at least one of your 2 picks, your regular scheduled picks, are going to be headed right back to Norway again. But Chris, I won't spoil that any further. What's your first pick, first official pick of the week?
Yeah, sticking in Norway, my first pick for the week is the band called Vicinity. This is one that I know Mike was kind of tossing around the idea of using, but I know he wanted to get a little more kind of breath on his pick. So I went with them. As soon as I saw prog metal, I couldn't pass them up. They fit the bill perfectly as far as that description. Checking them out on the progressivesubway.com as far as reviews go for their newest album, 8. They are recommended for any fans of Seventh Wonder, Circus Maximus, Dream Theater, or Rush. And I can definitely hear the Rush, especially in the drumming. So I was drawn into it immediately. But in addition to that kind of Rush sound, you have the heavy keyboard and all that, but you also have just the really driving metal riffs to mix in that you're not typically going to get with Rush. So it's a great combination and absolutely beautiful vocals. In this review, it's listed as no diamond in the rough nonsense, just plain old professionally performed and recorded music in the traditional prog metal landscape. So if you're a fan of prog rock, if you're a fan of metal, or if you're a fan of prog metal, they're going to be right up your alley.
Yeah, this is a band that certainly fits right into this podcast. I feel like this certainly could be the theme song for the podcast. Very clean sound. I did like one comment from that same review from the Progressive Subway where they says 8, which for those listening at home, that's Roman numeral 8, so VIII. Proves to be a dazzling experience. Deliciously melodic lead play fills every pore of this record. And the drummer is no slouch when it comes to showing off either. Vicinity probably once heard Mike Portnoy say, "My style is basically more is more," and then made it their mantra. I mean, that perfectly describes a lot of progressive metal, but there's certainly no exception to that. Mike, your thoughts?
Yeah, when I heard this, I listened to the whole album top to bottom, and I thought, man, this is almost too easy of a pick. It's just and going back to that review from the Progressive Subway, another part of that quote that I thought was funny and kind of describes how I felt about it. The reviewer says, when reviewing bands as underground as we do, it's always a nice change of pace to review a band who, above all else, are just really good at the whole making music business. And that was kind of what it was. It was like, I don't really hear a flaw in this music. It's perfect. Hear a lot of Dream Theater there. The song Distance kind of had the Shadow Gallery feel with maybe a more meaty, full sound. There's no question that all the members of this band are incredible. But at the same time, I never felt like their musicianship took away from the central goal of creating songs. Like, it wasn't just, let's do as much as we can for no good reason. They still felt contained.
It feels like sometimes these types of bands have a self-importance about them, where it feels like there's some sort of higher purpose other than making great music. And that's when you can really get down the wrong path with this kind of stuff. This group doesn't really feel that way. It feels like the goal was just to make the best record they could, and they knocked it out of the park.
Yeah. And I know that reviewer kind of mentioned their lead vocalist in almost kind of a detriment, because he was just such a good, clean vocalist. There wasn't enough gimmick or catchiness to his voice, I suppose, for that reviewer. And I just think that's kind of this band. They just all do their jobs really well.
Yeah, I definitely recommend that. Any one of the three of us could have picked this, and Chris ended up picking Vicinity with Roman numeral 8, VIII, for his first pick. Chris, what is your second pick, or technically third pick of the week?
Yeah, my third pick for the week on this special bonus edition is going to be a band called Valhalla Awaits from the UK with their third EP, Perdition. This EP, it's short, it's less than 30 minutes, and as far as recommending any songs off of it, I would just say give it a listen on your drive to work, depending on how long your drive to work is. Just listen to the whole thing. Staring at the Gun, maybe one of the best songs I'd say for this week's release across all the bands we listen to. Just very catchy hard rock is what I would say they specialize in. After you get done checking out Staring at the Gun, move on down to Is Anybody Out There? I know that's one that's been very popular amongst their fans. But just it's hard to really describe this band. It's just all around great hard rock.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to say it. I thought it was just very straightforward rock. There was a review from Distorted Sound magazine that mentioned Staring at the Gun, said it was reminiscent of early Alter Bridge, albeit less polished. And I kind of hear a little bit of that in that track, but they're very solid, very, very good hard rock sound. And I thought even for an EP, which is a little bit shorter, I thought it was a really good listen. Mike, your thoughts?
Yeah, this was another band that just does their job really well. Kind of similar to Vlad and Tears, not sonically, but in the sense that they don't really drift into any one subgenre too much. They're just a hard rock band, and that's fine. I don't often pay a lot of attention to the individual members of the bands, but to read that they were all members of prior established bands, it kind of makes sense why they just sound super polished and their music just sounds professional. My first exposure was pulling up the video too. Is There Anybody Out There? And I thought, these guys are just a hard rock band, but they're really good at it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, sometimes the best thing you can say about a band is they just sound professional.
Yeah.
They just sound like these guys know what they're doing, and they know what they wanted out of this album, and they jumped in the studio and just knocked it out. And I thought it was really good. If you're a fan of hard rock, definitely check out Valhalla Awaits with Perdition, the EP. Time to move on to my picks, and I also have a bonus pick, but we'll save that for the end. And really, it's kind of a bonus pick of the podcast because we all kind of wanted to mention this one, but I wanted to save it for the end before we go to break. My first pick of the week is the band Alterium with the album Of War and Flames. They are a power metal band out of Italy. This is their first album. They're a female-led band. Nicoletta Rossellini is the lead singer. She is fantastic. This band is just really, really good. You love power metal, these guys are going to be right up your alley. There was really no weak tracks on this album, but some of my favorites included Drag Me to Hell, Siren's Call, Of War and Flames, the title track, and Firebringer. And they also did a cover of Sabaton's Bismarck, which I thought was really outstanding. A couple of bands choosing to stick a cover at the end of their album this week. it's just great. If you watch their video, you just get that feeling of how so many of those bands are. It's just a great, powerful sound, not a weak track on this album. And I think it's overall one of the more solid bands that we've had across the podcast, not just this week. Mike, your thoughts?
Yeah, so when I put these lists together, it goes alphabetically. So for this week, Alterium was one of the first bands I checked out, and just seeing their video of War in Flames, my takeaways immediately were, okay, this band's really good. This video is really well shot. This is a professional unit again. And I had a feeling this might have ended up being one of my picks, but I ended up going in different directions. Clearly, I was unaware of just how strong the Italian metal scene is, because here's another example of just another fantastic band. Checking out that album, really enjoyed Drag Me to Hell like you did. I thought Crossroads Inn was an interesting song that truly just felt like you were walking into a medieval tavern or in that period of time. Just good stuff, top to bottom.
Just really, really great group out of Italy, Alterium of War in Flames. Chris, your thoughts on Alterium?
Like Mike said, it's amazing that we keep coming across these amazing power metal bands from Italy. I think we're starting to really get ingrained in their kind of music scene here. And they were one that, just like Mike and you, they were close to being on the top of my list as well. The vocals from Nicoletta Rossellini just blew me away, like right from the get-go on the opening track. And a lot of your favorite tracks off the album were mine as well. I especially love Siren's Call, and just kind of the entire atmosphere from the album cover straight up to the music itself. It's very, I kind of say, old worldy, almost Greek sounding.
Yeah, just a really great sound. Definitely check out Alterium of War in Flames, a really outstanding release from March the 8th. My final regular pick is another one of these frontier-driven supergroups that appear kind of every couple of weeks. It appears from Frontier Records, and it's the End Machine with the album release, The Quantum Phase. This is a project that George Lynch put together, of course, Lynch Mob, ex-Dokken guy, with Jeff Pilson, who still with Foreigner, I think, but has been with a bunch of MSG, Dokken as well. Originally, drummer Mick Brown was with them, and singer Robert Mason. They have since hired a new drummer and a new singer. The new singer is Girish Pradhan, who I believe Mike has come across in some of the music stuff that we've looked at. I think his band Girish and the Chronicles has come up a couple of times, but this is just really fantastic. If you like Dokken or Tesla from the 80s, this is going to remind you of that, and with good reason. But Girish Pradhan sounds like he could come in and sing any of the Dokken and Tesla songs and probably knock it out of the park. They find a singer that can come in and just absolutely belt out these songs that are just, again, sounds like something would have been out of the mid to late 80s or early 90s, and they just really sound amazing. This is their third studio album. Standout tracks, I mean, it's all great, but my three favorites were Black Hole Extinction, Killer of the Night, and Silent Winter, which was probably one of my favorite tracks across this entire podcast that we've done. I thought it was incredibly outstanding. Again, this is just one of those bands that is a perfect fit for this show. Blabbermouth had a great quote that said, "Everyone now is a supergroup, but once in a while there's a band that emerges that truly defines what it is to be a supergroup." One of these bands is the End Machine, who are now on their third studio album. And it mentions the End Machine sound remaining intact, bringing to mind classic Dokken and Tesla with a modern twist. This was just awesome stuff. Great to come across this. Mike, your thoughts?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. This band came together as basically Dokken without Don Dokken, but plug in the singer from Warrant, Robert Mason. Obviously not the classic singer of Warrant, but the guy who's been with Warrant for many years now. They moved on from him and brought in Girish, who just has a ridiculously strong voice. I think his vocal style would lend itself to any kind of 80s inspired pop metal or hard rock. George Lynch, it's weird to say that he's underrated, but I think in some regards he is. I think he and Pilson and Mick Brown, who obviously is not with the band anymore, but his brother is now the drummer. To me, I mean, they in a lot of ways are what made Dokken kind of that top tier of the 80s metal scene. it's so easy to pigeonhole so many of those hair bands in like this lowest common denominator level. And musically speaking, Dokken was always really, really, really strong. And you hear it here between just musically speaking and then Gearish, like his screaming at the beginning of Hell or High Water is amazing. Pilson's backing vocals sound really good with Gearish as well. Good stuff. What can I say?
Yeah, this is one of the stronger releases I've had the chance to put on my list any week, and would love to see these guys live if they go around touring. I think this would be a really great concert. Chris, your thoughts on the End Machine?
One thing I always appreciate is, you love it when a musician goes out and tries to do something new with their sound, but it also speaks volumes when a musician goes back and intentionally tries to keep the sound that they've had. Speaking on George Lynch, this is a very intentional move on his part to kind of keep that sound that he's always had. And I agree with Mike that he's an underrated performer. And I don't think that kind of having Dokken without Don Dokken is necessarily a bad thing. If anything, I'd say it's an improvement, and that's kind of what you get here.
Yeah, it's definitely something everybody should check out. It is a really, really great album, The Quantum Phase, released on March the 8th. And then I have a bonus pick, and Mike brought this to my attention a couple of weeks ago, because obviously he puts these lists together in advance of the release date. And he said, hey, you need to look at this. And as soon as I saw the picture for it, I'm like, okay, like this is going to have to be really bad for us to not talk about it on the podcast. And it wasn't bad. It was actually great and amazing. It is a band, if you want to call it that, because it's a one-man band, called I Am the Intimidator, with the album I Am the Intimidator. And yes, this is a fantasy-based reimagining detailing the final day of Dale Earnhardt's life. It is put together by a guy by the name of Andrew Stromstad. This is the strangest thing I've ever come across, but the music is amazingly good, which is just baffling in some ways. But Angry Metal Guy described it best. He said, I Am the Intimidator is equally pleasing and bizarre in almost every single way, be it the wild diversity throughout these 6 tracks or the concept itself. I can't help but smile and cringe simultaneously, from the jaw-dropping weirdness of Regrets to the out-of-place old man's child rasps and Eat My Smoke. My mind can't confirm if this little project is pure genius or a complete joke. That said, I kind of like it, and the fact that it's dynamic makes it easy on the ears when played on repeat. This record might be one of the strangest things I've ever reviewed, and you won't believe it until you hear it. If you are a fan of rock music, if you are a fan of NASCAR, if you're a Dale Earnhardt fan, you must check out I Am the Intimidator. I don't even know what else to say about it. Mike, you're the one that brought this into our world. Your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I'm still amazed this is real. But when doing my initial search and running into it, I first brought to my attention was the video for Eat My Smoke. And it's one of those things where if you're really sick and you have weird dreams, you wake up the next day and you're like, I had the weirdest dream. It was this metal band, but it's Dale Earnhardt with a bastard sword. And I don't even know how that thought enters your mind, what it takes to arrive at this as a creative endeavor, but it's way better than it has any right to be.
To arrive at that as a creative endeavor, to be talented enough to actually write and perform music that actually sounds good. Because it's one thing to have a joke about writing an album about Dale Earnhardt and then it's just terrible, or it's like country music. This is hard rock as hard rock gets. There's growling vocals, there's clean vocals, there's whatever kind of metal you'd want. It's the most bizarre thing I think I've ever seen, and it's actually really good, and everybody should check it out. Chris, your thoughts on I Am the Intimidator?
Yeah, I think the only thing I have to add on top of that is just a quote from Andrew Stromstad himself. He said, I grew up worshiping NASCAR. There was a fire meme about Dale Earnhardt that said, turn left for mediocrity, turn right for immortality, and it stuck with me forever. Originally, I set out to make something humorous in nature, but then I watched a few Dale Earnhardt documentaries and found myself as the butt of the joke instead. There was a reason why he was revered and worshipped. He was a man of the people, and he defied odds. He destroyed barriers. His ego was not indicative of his influence. He was as real as anyone can come. Once I came to that understanding, it was no longer a joke. It was a tribute to one of the greatest men to ever walk and roll this earth, Dale Earnhardt. I hope passerbys understand this outpouring of love. So kind of great to see that it did kind of start out as a joke, but once he realized that kind of the outreach that Dale Earnhardt had. He's like, you know what, maybe I should really take this seriously as far as a tribute goes. And I think he's really succeeded in that.
It's so bizarre. You must watch it. If you're listening to this podcast, you should pause this podcast right now and you should pull that album up and listen to it at this moment and then come back for the vault, because it's the craziest thing I think I've ever seen.
I just hope down the road we get a Jeff Gordon tribute album.
That might be interesting for sure.
I just wonder, was his change of heart and making it serious, was it because he learned more about Dale Earnhardt, or was it because as this project came together, he realized the music was really good? So it would have been dumb to then say, no, this is a joke. I actually want to take serious credit for this because this is amazing.
Could be either one, because it was really amazing. And obviously Dale Earnhardt still beloved to this day. Maybe he's still the most beloved driver, even so many years after his death now. But definitely check out I Am the Intimidator, our bonus pick this week on the Nerdcast Empire. And that is going to take us to a break. When we come back, we're going to take you into the vault. Each of us will pick a classic album from the archives that you should check out. We'll do that on the other side of this timeout here on the Nerdcast Empire. Back on the Nerdcast Empire, Music Mondays is well underway. We are getting ready to head into the vault. Before we do that, don't forget to check out our website, nerdcastempire.com. We've got a store there at nerdcastempire.com/store. You can get your merch right there on the Nerdcast Empire. Coming up this Sunday, it'll be part 2 of our efforts to fix, quote unquote, AEW. If you haven't had a chance to listen to part 1, it dropped yesterday. You can check that out wherever you get your podcasts. We'll be doing that coming up next week. And then, of course, 1 week from today, we'll have Music Monday again. Looks like another stacked list of songs and albums from the week of March the 15th. That'll be coming up next week on the Nerdcast Empire. And again, we've got a lot of great WrestleMania content coming your way in a couple of weeks as we get ready for the biggest pay-per-view of the year, a premium live event on the WWE Universe, WrestleMania. So we'll be talking about that in a couple of weeks on the Nerdcast Empire. But it is time to go into the vault once again. We've got 3 really great choices for you each week. And we're going to start with Chris. Chris, what is your choice in the vault this week?
Yeah, we talk about bands on this podcast that have kind of come up with their own description of their sound. So I figured it best to finally add someone in the vault who has done just that. They describe their sound as kind of an evil disco. So this week I'm adding in the Wisconsin Death Trip album from Static X, their debut album from 1999. Static X was a band that wasn't immediately on my radar as I was first kind of getting into the heavier music. They popped up, I believe, back in the Pandora days. They might have popped up on one of my Tool radio stations. Not necessarily sure why, but I was happy they did. Heavy industrial sound. For anybody that knows Wayne Static, he definitely has kind of an individual voice to go along with his amazing head of hair that he had. But this album, not necessarily the one that I wore out the most growing up. I'd say Shadow Zone probably takes that. But this one, I think, blows away any album they released afterward as far as the amount of heavy hitting tracks that they drop. This one, if I had to pick any Static X album that I would call a front to backer, as we say on the podcast, it would be this one. Push It, coming out as their first single and maybe still their biggest song today as far as people that are trying to get into Static X. Paired it with their music video that used some of the Tool-esque claymation. Following that with track 2, I'm With Stupid, at one point was my favorite track of theirs of all time. Follow that up with Bled for Days, Love Dump. I mean, the list just goes on. And even today, I'm still finding new love for songs, especially some of the ones at the end of the album, like The Trance is the Motion. It's exactly what they describe it as, evil disco. And I think it definitely deserves a place in the vault.
Yeah, Static X certainly always kind of reminds me of an era. We talk about it a lot on the vault. When we talk about certain bands, it kind of takes you back to a time. And for me, Static X takes me back to that late 90s when you started having the crossover from kind of the grunge alternative of the mid 90s to more of that new metal, whatever, post grunge. I don't know what you technically would call that would start into the 2000s. And it felt like Static X was kind of on that borderline as they moved along with that movement. Obviously, this is a big album for them. I wasn't the biggest Static X fan, but certainly familiar with their hits like Push It, which was on this album. They had, I think, 3 singles come off of this album that were all pretty big hits, and certainly a great choice for an album from the vault. Mike, your thoughts?
Yeah, I definitely a big fan of Push It when it came out, and I'm with Stupid. Those were definitely kind of the gateway into their sound. What I really appreciated about Static X is they were new metal, but instead of like douchiness or whininess, it was like industrial angry robot infused instead. I always kind of liked that side of the new metal sound more. Bands like Static X and Powerman 5000, that was more my thing. Yeah, just classic stuff. And you're right, it does take you back to an era. And honestly, I'm glad to see they're still around now with their new singer, essentially, just as a tribute act. I mean, their last 2 albums were really well received, so I definitely need to spend more time with them, but definitely a good choice.
And the guy that produced their album, Ulrich Wild, produced so many of those other acts at that time. He produced the Buck Cherry self-titled release, or actually engineered that one in 1999. He produced Powerman 5000, Tonight the Stars Revolt. He produced the song Wait and Bleed for Slipknot in 1999, mixed the Dysfunction album for Stained in 1999. So clearly he was working with a lot of those groups, kind of on both sides of the new metal, but also some of the later rock bands that were kind of coming out of the mid 90s. So yeah, definitely check that out. If you're a fan of Static X or just kind of want to hear music from that late 90s era that really kind of tells you what rock music was about, then it's definitely worth checking out Wisconsin Death Trip.
And completely unintentional, but it just turned out that yesterday was the 25th anniversary of this album. Didn't really mean to do that when I picked this, but it worked out. And it turns out the band is doing kind of a 25th anniversary celebration, and they're working on a documentary just kind of covering the life and times, the formation and almost disbandment of Static X, and then as well as their continuance after Wayne Static's untimely passing in 2014. So I'm definitely going to have to check that out. It'll be great to see some of the behind the scenes footage of that. And like you mentioned, I'm glad they're continuing to go on and that more people are learning about Static X and Wayne Static's work.
Yeah, no question about that. Yeah, it was weird to see that post, but certainly timely. Every once in a while, things kind of line up when you're kind of looking at that stuff. So definitely check those guys out. Mike, we're going to head to your pick in the vault next. And of course, you are continuing down your trip in the alphabet. And I believe we were on to the letter E this week.
We are most certainly on to the letter E. So this next band is a band that I could pick any number of their albums. One of my favorite bands. But I with the vault, I kind of wanted to stick to where I got into them. So it's definitely an older one of their releases, more in their power metal days. But the band in question is Edguy with their 1998 album Vainglory Opera.
It's definitely one of those groups that I regret that I have not had the chance to see these guys live. And they didn't tour a bunch, which kind of caused that to be the case. But a ton of great releases. This is certainly one of those really great releases from the late 90s.
Yeah, their second official album. They're a German power metal band for those who aren't familiar. Kind of cool. This album was mixed by Timo Tolkki from Stratovarius and featured vocals from Hansi Kirsch from Blind Guardian, who both those guys are serious heavy hitters in the power metal space. This album was just a big deal for me getting into power metal and just discovering it in the late 90s and early 2000s. This is definitely Edguy as a power metal band, which after this album, a few albums later, they kind of transformed into more really kind of a pop metal or hard rock band, which wasn't bad. They still sounded really good, but if you still kind of wanted that power metal sound, you almost had to go to lead singer Tobias Sammet's side project, Avantasia, which was like an ensemble cast of who's who in power and symphonic metal, which is really cool, and you should check it out too. But for this album, definite just early days Edguy power metal tracks like Until We Rise Again, Scarlet Rose, Vainglory Opera, Fairy Tale, Walk on Fighting, No More Foolin'. Their cover of Ultravox, a new wave band from Great Britain. The song Hymn is really good. And But Here I Am, just really, really tremendous stuff.
Yeah, Edguy is another one of my favorite bands, another one you introduced me to. This is a really great album. I think I got more into them as far as their music with their next release, which was Theater of Salvation. and then really got into them with Mandrake, which is probably still my favorite Edguy release. But like you said, Vainglory Opera really is that true power metal vibe from them. If you're looking for their power metal era, this is a good place to start. In fact, the title track itself, it just starts out this bombastic like horn part that just kind of every time it comes on my iPod, it's just like immediately you know what it is and you're just excited for the song. But it's another one of these groups that were able to take things like horns and work it into their power metal and make it fit. And I think that was something that unfortunately a lot of bands that were in this genre in the US at this time were basically underground because grunge and alternative music had kind of taken over the airwaves. You have to go to Europe to find a lot of these big bands, and Edguy being one of them, that continue to be popular even in the late 90s and beyond.
Yeah, I think kind of after pop metal ended and grunge kind of took over here, there almost became a stigma on anything grandiose. Like you had to instead be as not over the top as humanly possible. Like they wanted something that was stripped down and I suppose maybe more relatable to the sensibilities of people over here. But your European power metal bands and even the occasional one over here just bucked that trend entirely and made their sound as bombastic and ridiculous as possible. And that's my kind of music.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And this is a great release from Edguy. Chris, your thoughts on Edguy and Vainglory Opera?
Yeah, once again, appreciate you for turning me on to Edguy a while back, Mike. And I'd say Vainglory Opera is, they were always great with coming up with their titles, because this definitely felt like I was sitting in front of just a theatrical event. Reading a review from the Encyclopedia Metallum, they say that the songwriting for this album wasn't far removed from their first two outings, but for the first time, everything is tight and focused. So I'm just curious, with you having kind of delved into their catalog through your history, would you say this is around the time they really kind of found their sound, or would you say it was already established by this point?
As far as my listening to them, I think this is kind of that first like fully fledged step in their development, at least as far as when I got into them. That, you know, I really haven't listened to a whole lot of Kingdom of Madness. I probably need to go back and visit it a little more. For me, Vainglory Opera was kind of where it began.
Yeah, it's just a really outstanding release, and they've got a ton of releases that are outstanding, so make sure you check out Edguy. And this week we're talking about Vainglory Opera. Well, after you decided to go through the alphabet, I decided to go through a chronological order with my vault picks after picking the 1969 release last week of Chicago Transit Authority with their self-titled debut album, which of course later became Chicago. So I decided to move on to 1970 and see if I could find a release that I could spotlight. And there were actually a few that were in there, including two albums from Black Sabbath, including their self-titled album in 1970, which is pretty impressive that they came out with two albums in the same year. But figuring that at least one of those may show up in the vault somewhere down the line, I decided to forego that and kind of go to a band that I was really a big fan of growing up. And that was Creedence Clearwater Revival with their 1970 release, Cosmo's Factory. The success of this album, obviously, if you know anything about CCR or classic rock, you're going to recognize a ton of these tracks. 6 of the 11 tracks on the album were released as singles in 1970, and all of them charted in the top 5 of the Billboard Hot 100. So it was just one hit after another for Creedence Clearwater Revival. Of course, the big tracks you're going to know are Traveling Band, Looking Out My Back Door, Run Through the Jungle, Up Around the Bend, Who'll Stop the Rain. Of course, a cover of I Heard It Through the Grapevine and Long As I Can See the Light. It's so rare when you see these classic rock bands and you know they have a bunch of hits. It's so rare for so many of them to be on one album. But this was the case with this one. It is John Fogerty certainly at his best, and just a fantastic example of really their best work coming on one album. They obviously had a lot of other hits, but I think if you're looking for the best bang for your buck, Cosmo's Factory is a good place to go. Mike, your thoughts?
Yeah, for me, CCR has always kind of been a greatest hits band. That they were so far before my time. I wasn't really familiar with their actual discography and what songs were on what album. So when you threw this out there and I looked it up, I was kind of amazed at just how many heavy hitters there were on it. I mean, obviously John Fogerty is a legend. Looking out my back door, Up Around the Bend, Who'll Stop the Rain. I mean, like Who'll Stop the Rain is just an all-time tremendous song. It even a part of just the CCR sound, it's just tremendous. And I kind of want to go back and listen to the rest of that album to see maybe what didn't track, but was still really solid.
And a lot of variety in those hits too. They don't all sound the same, even because sometimes their sound does kind of pigeonhole into a certain vibe, but there's a little variation there in the stuff on this album. I mean, obviously, as long as I can see, the light's a little slower, Heard It Through the Grapevine's a little bit slower. Up Around the Bend has a different sound than Looking Out My Back Door. Like it's great diversity in their hits. And like I said, just a really great album. Chris, your thoughts on the CCR release Cosmos Factory?
Yeah, you talk about all the big hits from CCR that were on this, but I appreciate just the callbacks to the bands and the music that they probably grew up with and that really inspired them. I mean, Traveling Band, they say, was inspired by Little Richard. You've got callbacks to Elvis Presley, Bo Diddley. So, I mean, I'm a guy, I absolutely love that old school blues feel. I mean, without old blues, you wouldn't have rock and roll as it is today. So it was great to see them not only make all these amazing songs of their own, but to kind of show everybody like, hey, here's where I got this from. This is where this sound comes from. So really appreciate that.
There's definitely a blues influence in their rock music. And I think when you look at what inspired this album and CCR in general, you definitely feel that blues rock influence that definitely goes into this. But definitely check that out if you get a chance. If you're a fan of CCR, or you probably already have checked out this album. If you're not, definitely check this out. It'll definitely give you a good background on some of their biggest hits. That is going to wrap things up for another episode of Music Mondays, and it was a loaded episode once again. So big thanks to the guys once again for joining me on the podcast. A big thanks to all the bands that have shared our podcast and everyone who has listened. Again, these Music Mondays have been going really well, and we really appreciate that. Don't forget to check out our website, nerdcastempire.com, for all your information about the Nerdcast Empire. We will be back on Sunday with another regular episode of the Nerdcast Empire. And then 1 week from today, it's Music Mondays once again when we look at the releases from March the 15th. That's going to wrap things up for this week. For the guys, once again, I am Matt saying so long. Don't forget to join the Empire, the Nerdcast Empire.